Yeah, it was peak 90s. Like even Mortal Kombat, right, had a secret character. It was kind of a thing that went like from the 90s forward, but you're right, it's kind of fallen out a little bit.
I'd like to see it. Like, I mean, I like having the full party, 7, 8, 16, you being like, here's your friend, here's this person, now they're your buddy, whatever. But I do think it would be cool to have like here's this one weirdo, go give them meat or whatever. Like that they live in a coffin, go figure it out.
Golgo, who lives in the mouth of another Esper.
Yeah, like just like here's this weird little guy, you can recruit him maybe if you do the right things.
Yeah, a lot of those things just they became I don't want to call them memes, but kind of their own little concept going forward. Like to this day, if I'm going somewhere far, I'm like, I'm getting in a whale and going to the moon.
Yes.
And most people are like, what are you talking about, right? But it just like stuck with me, and I'm like, yeah, we're taking a whale to the moon. That's what's happening.
Just a reminder, this is a spoiler-heavy podcast. Different series that require a spoiler warning will be in the description. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Gaming Theater Podcast. Today's episode is going to be a brief look at the overview and themes that are presented in Final Fantasy VI, specifically the game Final Fantasy VI, and kind of how it sort of generates a way that they put things in 6 that they'll use for other Final Fantasies later down the line as well. And we'll explain them all of that when we get into this. Now, before we get started, I have a couple of guests with us today who are going to help explain and go through this episode for us. Now, just to start off, my name is Leo, also known as the Geek Scorpio, and I'll be your host this evening. And over to my right is going to be...
My name is Liz, also known as Zombiehand. I do a lot of work for GTP, as well as art and such on my own. You can find me on Blue Sky at Zombiehand or Instagram at Zombiehand Creations.
All right. And over to their left is going to be...
Hi, my name is DandDaine. You've probably heard my voice before if you've listened to other GTP offerings. If you haven't, check them out. They're awesome. I'm an award-winning DM and a Twitch streamer and just a big, dumb nerd. Good to see you again. You can find me on Twitch and Blue Sky and everywhere. DandDaine. Looks like Diane, but it's not.
All right, and I've got those into each of the descriptions. And with that, we have a very special guest from a very special podcast with us.
Hello, my name's Ernest, and I'm one of the co-hosts of the Final Fantasy Files podcast. And among that, I do some other podcasts, and I'm a recovering cybersecurity person for a normal living, I guess, if you want to call it that.
I felt that in my heart.
Hi, Ernest.
All right, now with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a quick trip to the magical merch booth. All right, so here we are at the magical merch booth, and we have a special podcast guest with us. And why don't you tell us a little bit more about your podcast and where we can find it and such?
Absolutely. So the main podcast I think that's most relevant to this podcast is called the Final Fantasy Files. You can find us finalfantasyfiles.com. Also, just look on YouTube for Final Fantasy Files. If you see my face there, you'll know it's our podcast. It's myself, my co-host Jolie, and then sometimes her husband Spencer gets on the podcast as well. And we just cover all things Final Fantasy. There are 2 other podcasts. One of them is called Fabula, Obscura, that is literally just odd and obscure things. Think paranormal, extraterrestrials, all that kind of stuff. And a third one that's about to be launched this year for personal finance, but it's not launched yet, so we can just skip over that one for now.
So the 2, possibly 3 later down the line for this.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool. Those all sound fantastic. One of which I probably desperately need. The other 2 that sound more up my alley in terms of interests, but that's awesome.
I love creepy stuff, so I'm about to go, and like weird stuff, so I'm about to go check out both of yours.
Yeah, that was just me and my childhood best friend. Well, not childhood, I met him in college, but my best friend since college, so over 20 years. And he's been into that, I'm into it too, so we decided to put a little podcast together. Nothing crazy, it's not like produced heavily like the Final Fantasy Files is, but it's still fun, right? And it's time to hang out with my best friend, so
that's
it's always
awesome.
good.
Love that.
And with that being said, let's go ahead and get back to the show. So, on today's episode, this is kind of a special episode because it was a Patreon sponsor episode, and we'll actually do other Patreon sponsors episodes like this as well in the future, which are episodes that are dedicated to exploring a theme or storyline or such within a video game. Now, we've done it before in the past. For one of our earliest ones was for the history of Symphony of the Night from Castlevania, but also we did one mostly to help out Zombiehand with getting her jollies off for Alan Wake, because biggest Alan Wake fan I know. Literally, our show notes for a while for that one was just ask Liz and leave.
And Lou, just to make sure, there'll be a Patreon link in the description. Yeah,
correct.
If people have an episode they're just burning to have happen, they can hit us up over there.
Yep. And with that being said, this one was a request to explore like themes and such through Final Fantasy VI specifically. And as you know, we're huge Final Fantasy fans here, but we've also talked about Final Fantasy VII a lot and other newer Final Fantasies, and sometimes older ones, especially when we did our episodes about Dungeons and Dragons and how that relates to Final Fantasy. 6 is kind of an interesting take because it's sort of right in the middle before we get kind of right after the sort of the beginning of the newer types of Final Fantasies and where they go versus the older Final Fantasies and where they go. To sort of brief on how that works out, Final Fantasy VI had most of its core designers and such went with a completely different philosophy than most of the other ones. And we talked about this before in our Final Fantasy, in some of our Final Fantasy, especially the costuming episodes, weirdly enough. But one of the things that happened in there is Final Fantasies, I think it's 2 through 4, specifically wanted to have a lead and a couple of extra characters, whereas Final Fantasy 1 was mostly based on Dungeons & Dragons, so you created your own character as you went, and you happened to be the Warriors of Light. In Final Fantasy 4, which was hugely their biggest storyline and one of the biggest Final Fantasies up to that point, they had it as a you followed Cecil as your main character, and Cecil went through and went through their adventures and the people who are with Cecil at the time, but you're almost all constantly with Cecil. For 6, they wanted to do something different, which was sort of their mandate on this, was that one of the themes was that everyone is a main character. Everyone's story is important. And this is the first one that they've actually tried to do, and one of the earliest just in console history, that they had multiple characters for this. Other games that we've talked about in the past have multiple characters that did other things for the storyline. Famously, we keep bringing it up, but this is really important. Maniac Mansion. Maniac Mansion had multiple endings, but they were all determined on who you brought in as part of your team. In this case, you start with one character, and very quickly you start to find out that you can just branch out to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things I think is really interesting and worth noting about 6 is that, you know, it really lays the groundwork and sort of the lifeblood for the games that follow after it. You know, you see a lot of similar themes explored in terms of like a steampunk aesthetic in 7. And that is, I think, in direct relation to the fact that they did it in 6 first, right? Magitech being sort of the progenitor of a lot of the Mako infrastructure that we see in 7. One of the things I think is really kind of interesting is like without 6, you know, we don't get 7. Without 7, you probably don't get 8 or 9. And I know 7, 8, and 9 are typically like seen as some of the best in the series. 6 also being, I think, necessary on that list. You know, I think colloquially a lot of people refer to 7, 8, and 9 as like the Trinity or whatever, just because it's the 3D, the first 3D. It's pretty easy to kind of group those 3 together. But I cannot understate, without 6, there is no 7, and that's huge.
Yeah, that was definitely what you're looking at is kind of the last evolution of these sprite-based games into the first generation of the polygon-based games. And so there was a little bit of I don't know what I want to call it, a dip, but anybody who played games around that era, whether it was on PlayStation 1 and 64 and a couple others, and we went into the first polygon games, there was a little bit of a sacrifice that was made in terms of, because these things, they take time, they cost money to produce, right? So if you're putting a lot more time and money into the artwork, other places get budget pulled from them, right? So this is one where you can see that a lot of money and time and effort was put into world building, character development, even as far as like, you know, the villain and the main villain in the game in general. Just so much was put into the characters in this game that it is a night and day difference between those that came before it, and even a little bit, you know, we could talk all about Sephiroth too, but I think Kefka, at least to me, is sits above Sephiroth in the realm of villains.
Especially for Final Fantasy villains, Kefka's probably, at least I know opinion-wise, is my favorite of all the villains that are out there. Now, as far as style-wise, Sephiroth does look cooler, but Kefka is just a whole different level of what they bring in, especially story-wise, as themselves as a villain.
It was one of the first, at least that I can remember in video gaming, because mind you, I was a early teenager when I played this game for the first time. It was the first time I noticed that someone had made a villain that you could almost empathize with, but not quite. And Sephiroth kind of carried that forward in 7, and you know, things changed after that. Where prior to that, in a lot of video games, things were, you know, pretty black and white. Villain was evil, period. Your party was good, period. There wasn't really a gray area. There wasn't a growth factor to your characters. The villains could not be empathized with. I think Kefka was the first one where they broke that mold. And again, I think it was just because they put all of their money and their heart into that game before they rolled on to 7.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. You know, I think that Kefka's an incredible villain, Sephiroth as well, right, in their respective rights. But you really spend more time with Kefka, it feels like, in 6 than you do with Sephiroth in 7. It's always, Sephiroth is reactive, whereas Kefka is active. You know, he's actively doing things. You're actively experiencing what's happening. Whereas the viewpoint of 7 is told kind of from the past, right? You're experiencing, oh, Sephiroth did this thing, and oh, he's back now somehow. What's the deal with that? And you're kind of trying to figure that out. Whereas with Kefka, he's there. He's meddling the whole time. To great effect, you know. I think as well, to your point, Ernest, with the bad guy's the bad guy and the good guy's the good guy. You know, no one cares about Golbez and his motivations. It's like, he's the bad guy, let's go fight him. You know, he's got to be stopped or what have you. I definitely agree. Kefka does a much better job of making you empathize and kind of question, like, well, he's not doing good things, but like, is he, you know, unredeemable, or is he fully evil? And then, I mean, I think eventually we kind of come to the same conclusion, probably. But
he does some bad stuff.
He does some bad things, for sure.
He does some very bad things. But the thing is, you know, they gave you that kind of little seed in the very beginning that, you know, this wasn't entirely his fault, and it was one of the first video game characters I remember them explicitly dealing with, like, the whole concept of mental illness, and you roll that in there, and like, so there's kind of a built-in empathy for him, even though it's, you know, I always compare him to Heath Ledger's version of the Joker, right? But if you take Joaquin Phoenix's performance of the Joker and you put it on the front end of Heath Ledger's, it makes so much more sense, right? Of how we got to that point. And again, there's a little bit of empathy built in there because at the core of it, it wasn't Kefka's fault. He was normal before, you know, what happened to him.
Being tortured and manipulated, and that's like, and infused with, like, one of the themes that I marked down for this episode is actually like natural versus artificial. And part of that is, you know, Terra's magic is natural to her because she's half Esper, whereas with Kefka and Celeste, theirs was infused into them. And so, but Kefka was tortured, and he was, like you said, he wasn't given, like, he was normal and he wasn't given a choice. I mean, he didn't really resist it.
Right.
But he also wasn't totally given a choice. But I kind of also wanted to go back to Dane's point talking about Sephiroth. And how we see a lot more of Kefka than we do of Sephiroth. And that was actually, and I don't have to tell Dane this, but that was intentional because we've never actually, at least if you only play the core game, you've never seen the real Sephiroth, except in the one flashback to Nibelheim. And so, you know, of course it's easy in the core game to consider him a villain, but then you find out later that was actually Genova. And then what was Sephiroth actually like? Oh, in that one flashback, we see that he was very human, and he was kind of driven to that brink by learning what he believed was his history or how he came to be. And I think that was it's a really beautiful difference, because Kefka is empathetic in one way, where we do get to know that he was a normal person and he was tortured into what he became, and he was just like driven to insanity. Whereas Sephiroth, you've never really encountered him until you play like the one memory in Nibelheim and then Crisis Core.
Right.
And I think that was, I think, setting up an empathetic villain that at first you're just like, that dude's nuts. He's crazy. And then you find out more as you go, and you're like, oh, like this is actually tragic. Especially like what it leads to down the way. I think that really opened the door to how 7 treated its villain.
Right, and it carried
not
all the
Hojo though.
Yeah, and it carried all the way forward. Like you look at 15 and Arden as a villain, right? And then you even look at 16 and Ultima as a villain, right? Like these things carried forward, and I think 6. You know, you could argue that 4 had some of this sub theme in there, and it did, to be honest. But I think 6 was the genesis of where we really got the more complicated and multifaceted villains, as opposed to those before that.
Yeah, and even sub-villains, we get to see a lot more empathetic sub-villains, and I'm a big proponent of 8, and I recognize it has a lot of flaws, but I love 8. And even like Idea is a sub-villain for, you know, most or for part of the game, and you find out everything that happened to her. Like being awakening as a sorceress is traumatizing and awful, and just getting to, you know, and then her journey of being manipulated by Ultimecia, and then in 16 as well, Benedicta and Kupka, and I think that was his name. It's been a minute.
Hugo Kupka.
Yeah, his boss fight was one of the best.
That one, that was crazy. That boss fight,
so cool. You know, you get to see, I really feel like 6 helped pave the way, because even like initially General Leo was against you, and then you get to R.I.P. General Leo.
Sorry, you died, Leo.
Press X to send respects.
F in the chats. I'm gonna do a bookmark of General Leo. I cross stitch nerd stuff. So, yeah, you even get to see characters like General Leo, who initially starts out as a villain, and you get to. I think that's beautiful that you get to see multiple sides, and General Leo switches sides at the one time, because he's like, I didn't realize what was going on, that it was this bad, or what the consequences were. And I just think it's really awesome that they were able, or that they started to implement those kinds of empathetic villains where you're like, oh, I actually love you.
Absolutely. And one thing I do want to point out for 6, since we're kind of in the early stages of talking about it here, is it's amazing. And it's actually very fortunate that we're talking about 6 right now, because if you think about it, like, you know, this is one where they brought in Magitech, right? And they brought in kind of technology, and they started merging the technology and magic themes inside of Final Fantasy. And it parallels our modern world today in many different ways. One of them is, you know, we're starting to incorporate AI into so many things, right? And, you know, functionally, you know, there's an analog there for magic, right? And technology. And so you bring humans and technology together. Of course, the initial clash is inefficient, violent in some cases. But there is a pretty bright future when the two are able to be harmonized at some point. But then you also have the other side of it where, you know, you have a villain like Kefka illustrates the other side of the coin as to the chaos that ensues when the two are improperly fused. And just, you know, you look around the modern world today, there are so many people in the world that kind of are a minor version of Kefka. And it's, you know, just by virtue of the times we're in and kind of the melding of technology and where we're at. And again, it's going to be very bad and, you know, violent for a while, but I think on the other side of the horizon, we have a very bright future, kind of like, you know, Final Fantasy VI portrayed, you know, towards the end of the game.
Yeah, I definitely think it is something that is worth touching on, right? You know, sort of the themes carrying forward into our modern day. I think that's absolutely an astute observation. You know, I just hope it doesn't end up going the way of the Maka reactors from 7, and that we're, you know, we're already damaging the planet, I guess. But I'm hoping it doesn't get any worse than that.
Yeah.
Right? I think you're
feel
right.
the planet bleeding. Can you hear her crying? Or what is he?
No one hopping off this train till it's over. Let's go. You know?
I
Man,
love
I love
Barrett
Barrett.
so much.
Oh, he's
Barrett
so
is
good.
so good. So
He's-
good.
My favorite character.
He's so good, honestly.
for sure.
His new voice actor in remake is
So
Oh, his
good.
VA is
incredible.
phenomenal in
So
the new
cool.
7 series. Just
Mhm.
So good.
unbelievable. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I
Probably
think it's
the
a really.
best.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree. You know, no hate. I was glad that Aerith's voice actress was nominated, but also I was like, we could have had Barrett up there too,
Yeah.
though. You know, like he did a
Barrett.
really good job. I digress, though. No, I think it's a really interesting idea. You know, philosophically, we are sort of at a crossroads between, you know, how to utilize this new technology or this new magic, as you
Mhm.
put it, ethically, and what that means for our civilization. And, you know, sure, unparalleled growth could be, you know, something we could tap into. But is there a cost to that? And I think that, you know, most people here would say, yeah, there would be a cost. We need to be careful. It needs to be relegated and treated correctly. You know, the rampant use of magic, or AI in this case, could be very damaging to a lot of different people in a lot of different ways if it's not used appropriately.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of the saying, nothing in this world is free.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything has a cost. It doesn't matter even if you can't find the cost, there's a cost involved and
Mhm.
someone's paying that cost. So you should always ask that question, you know, what is the cost involved for this thing, whatever it is?
Yeah.
When I
You know,
first heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch, you know, somebody, I think it was in training at a job, and somebody explained that. And I don't know, I was young and mind blown. And just like, yeah, somewhere somebody is paying for it. It's
Yeah.
not just
Mhm.
because it's free to you doesn't mean it's free all around.
And I think that's interesting because, you know, as you mentioned, there are a number of Kafka-esque people running around in our real world, and, you know, they want to utilize the power of this new technology for, I don't want to say nefarious purposes, right? Necessarily. I don't think anyone starts out hoping to be the villain. I hope no one does.
Right.
That's the kind of world I want to live in anyway. But I do think it's really interesting that the parallels do exist and you can draw to them, and that 6 is sort of the progenitor of this. I don't know that if 6 was the first to do the sympathetic villain or the best to do it at the time or what have you, but I do know that it did sort of pave the way for another one of my favorite games, and a sympathetic villain being Tales of Symphonia. There's a character named Kratos. I'm not quite sure. It's not the God of War character, but I think it's spelled the same. Who starts out as kind of a good guy, and then there's a heel turn later on. But like you sort of feel for his story because he's doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. Maybe a little bit unlike Kafka, but it definitely sort of reminds me of, you know, oh man, if your situation had been different, you would have been a different person. And I think that's fascinating, sort of that villainy being pushed forward, Kafka forward, you know.
Yeah, and like you said, I don't know if it came into video games before this. It may have, because the other thing that there's a lot of that the other area where there are a lot of parallels with Final Fantasy VI is actually with Lord of the Rings, and that trilogy was written almost 50 years before the game was produced, right? So if you think about that's probably where the origin of that sympathetic villain thing came from, as far as in the fantasy world. I'm sure there's other places that, you know, it was at, but 6 borrows a lot from Lord of the Rings as well.
Yeah, I definitely wasn't trying to say this 6 was the origin of the sympathetic villain.
Oh no,
But in Final Fantasy, I mean, I think in 4, you know, finding out it's very Star Warsy, and finding out that, you know, I think Golbez is his brother. It's just, you know, like that's really interesting. And even Cain, like, I think that he has a lot of moments to his character, like, why did he betray Cecil?
There's a lot of Star Wars in this series too. I mean, look at Biggs and Wedge, right?
Yeah,
those are
they don't even
directly
hide
from
that
Star
one.
Wars.
Well, I think it was oh my god, was it Nomura who was Sakaguchi was such a big fan of Star Wars that he was like, I want a Biggs and a Wedge too.
Just bring them in. There's nothing wrong with that. And
except initially it was Vix in 6. It was Vix and Wedge, but that was a translation thing.
I do think it's really interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You brought up 4 and sort of the characters, and I think that Cecil, or Cecil, however you pronounce that, is very interesting, right? In sort of a reverse way. You've got a character who starts out as sort of this darker character, and you watch them sort of become the hero that they're supposed to be. So I think that's also kind of interesting, and does sort of they play with that a little bit in 4, more in 4 than they do in 6. But you can definitely see some of that groundwork also paying off in 6 for like, what is a hero? What does that look like? You know, does it have to be someone who's in shiny plate armor all the time, or can they be a little bit dinged up and scuffed up at first and then sort of change?
That's an excellent point. And even the Sid character in many of the games, carries that, because they often start out, on one side of the fence. It plays a trope where, it's kind of like the scientist or the engineer who just has their head down doing their work, right? They're not paying attention really to, their benefactor or whatever and what they're doing with it. And then they have that epiphany at a certain point that their benefactor is in fact evil and using their work for something wrong. And then it sets up that moment where that non-hero type character has the ability to make the choice to become the hero and then transform their character's arc in the game.
Not to turn this into a Final Fantasy IV podcast, but I actually think so. I know in the 3D remake they call him Cecil, but I always go with Cecil.
It's like Titus and Titus, or Zidane and Zidane.
Yeah,
like, everyone's got opinions. I get it.
Yeah. I think that his transformation was actually brilliant, because when he does choose to go, like, Dark Knights are he's a Dark Knight.
He's a Dark Knight.
He's powerful, he's so strong, and you're just like slaying enemies left and right. And then when you do the journey to the top of the mountain and he becomes a paladin and he's back at level 1, and it's like, put him in the back row. You do not want this dude, like, he's gonna level up really fast, but he is so weak at first. And it's like, that's such a cool concept to be like, I am going to sacrifice my strength and everything that I have become so that I can become better and follow what I believe is right. And that's just so cool to me.
I didn't put him in the back row when I got to that point. That was a mistake.
Yeah, that's a mistake.
Yeah, and there are a lot of those, right? The not just the redemption arc, but kind of the Judeo-Christian, Christ figure type things, right? So like that's one example, and then another one that comes to mind in 6 is the whole concept of the Magicite, right? And so the experiments that went so wrong with Kefka and were moderately successful with Celeste were in fact that way because in order for the power to be transferred its maximum capacity, the Esper had to basically self-sacrifice, right? So it's one of those where they had to want to do it, and it had to be their own choice. You couldn't take the magic from them at full power. They had to willingly offer it and give it and become the Magicite, right? So that's another theme in here where, the not so good forces, if you want to put it that way, were trying to extract things by force and didn't realize that was not the correct way to go about it.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Leo.
Yeah, you're fine.
Kefka, like that one scene when he's like, "Oh, I'm done with you," and he tosses Shiva and Ifrit down the trash chute, and then you go down after them, and they're like, "We want to give you our full power, like what's left of our power," and then they willingly turn into the Magicite from there. Kefka has no idea because he's like, "I got what I want from you."
Right. And that theme was carried all the way forward into 16, right? So for Clive to be able to usurp the power of these other entities, granted, some of them, he did what he had to do, but the ones that were his friends in his party, they had to willingly give it for him to take it at full power. Yeah.
I have a lot of feelings about the scene with Jill giving hers, but that's for another podcast. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of thoughts.
To put a quote to a point of conversation earlier, I think Jeff Goldblum nailed it on the head. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. It's kind of that idea of the worker having their head down and just kind of doing it, and then looking up and being like, "Oh, I've made nuclear weapons or whatever, magical nuclear weapons for this guy. Oh man, maybe I shouldn't have done that."
Wait,
that's sort of that remorse.
Are we the bad guy?
Yeah.
That's why
exactly. Are we the bad guy? That's
why our armor has spikes on it, Leo. Exactly.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons that Oppenheimer was such a great movie, right? Because it played on that duality of like, you are you are doing something that is fundamentally going to let the genie out of the lamp, so to speak, and it could go many different ways. And then when you realize what you've done, that's something that's difficult, I think, for anybody to have to live with after that.
Yeah, and too late at that point too, right? The knowledge is
too
already
late.
out
Yeah,
there.
you can't put it back, right? It's out now.
In fact, that's part of the theming for that, because once they figure out how that magicite is, what you need to do, the Emperor makes a plan to try a game plan to get a lot more magicite, and it isn't until too late the Emperor figures out that, oh crap, this is a mistake. We should stop. And then Kefka's like, nah, brah, I started this. We're gonna keep on trucking.
Exactly. It reminds me so much of 16, right? Where Ultima is like assuming that he's gonna send Clive around. He's gonna set up all these battles for Clive to take all of these powers, and then he's just gonna take the vessel, and doesn't realize that it's not going to work out the way he thinks it is. And at the last moment, he's like, he's a god, and he's befuddled at what's going on, right? That the plan is not working the way he thought it was. And you always think like, it's like, what is it Mike Tyson says? Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Yeah.
Then the plan's out the window. So yeah, this is a perfect example of that.
Oh yeah. So the thing with the magicite, that was in the core, even in its design. So Final Fantasy traditionally, with the exception of, I think, 7 and 6, and to an extent 8, 7, 6, and 8 are classless systems. It doesn't matter who you have. You can just give them whatever character magicite's in there, and then they'll be able to cast magic. Whatever magic you gave them, and then they get to keep it, and you can hand it off to another person. You can spend a weird way of grinding just to give everybody literally every spell in the game if you wanted to. To its detriment, this also means that you can have whatever person that you want on your party. That's not a detriment. That's a cool thing. However, then you can actually miss a ton of stuff, because depending on what your characters you have in your party at certain times, there is different dialogue operations and different things. I didn't find out until getting information for this podcast, because I've done it so often. One of the first times you can change around your characters really early on is with Sabin and Edgar. And you can lose their entire backstory if you decide for funsies to not have Sabin in your party. That is an option, and you can just do that.
Oh yeah, you can miss the coin toss scene. Which is huge. And especially, I wonder if that, so later on in the game when Edgar does the coin flip with Setzer on the airship, and Setzer's like, oh my god, it's a double-sided coin. I applaud you. That's awesome. I'm going to give this one to you. That's rad. And then Sabin's like, that's like the moment that it really clicks in his head. Oh my god, my brother used a double-sided, Edgar didn't want Sabin to have to sacrifice his freedom, so that's why he did the coin toss and with the double-sided coin, so he knew that he was going to be sacrificing his own freedom so Sabin could have his. And I think that's such a great choice. Maybe Edgar didn't, neither of them, I think, wanted the throne, but Edgar was like, well, I'm ready to take it, I guess.
Yeah. Heavy is the head that wears the crown.
Yeah. And so having I wonder if you don't have Sabin in the party, that scene in the airship with Setzer might hit different, because you don't know what coin toss he's talking about, or does that not even or does Sabin not have that recollection, or I wonder how that would play out. Maybe when I start the game on my Switch again, I'll I'll not put one of the best characters in my party and see what happens.
Or one of the greatest characters in my party. Yeah, you're benched.
He's the best.
He's
I love
so cool.
Sabin.
I guess so each of the characters have their own backstories and such that go with this, for different reasons. So Terra, for example, is half Esper, half human. Terra doesn't know that at the beginning, though.
Spoilers, gosh.
That's why this is a spoiler-heavy podcast. If you missed that warning at the beginning of this episode, why you're gonna fast forward the first 10 seconds of this episode? That's just
you're gonna have to dub that in.
But no, so each of the characters have their own backstory, and it's for the most part, a lot of them are really rich backstories. Some of them get kind of funky because since you can, Gal is left out into the wilds, you can have, which is just as a beast man basically, and Gal has when you have him in your party, he is probably he's one of the most missable characters that you could have afterwards. And most of his backstory I got from other people when I was playing it, talking to them on how because I didn't have the right characters on there. You can introduce Gao to his dad, and he's like, well, that was fun. Later.
Well, Gao is missable. If you you have to have meat on you. You have to know that you have to toss meat to him. He's especially for a time when games were like, here's a game, have fun. No, very few, if any, tutorials. Like going through 6, they're like, go to South Figaro or go to Figaro Castle. It's in the desert. And you're like, hope I find it, and it kind of like guides you in the right way. But, there's no arrows pointing you where to go. There's nothing at the top that's like, like a compass. Oh, your destination's that way. And so nothing's telling you feed meat to Gao and that's how you'll get him or whatever. So if you don't do it, like, he's totally missable. And another one is if you don't wait for Shadow on the Fallen Continent,
that's a huge one. Yeah,
you never find out that he's Realm's father, and so it's crazy. Like, I think that would be. I mean, some games are pretty, like, vicious nowadays where they're like, we're not going to tell you anything. But then there's also games where it's very handholdy. And I wonder in a Final Fantasy VI remake if they would be like, wait for Shadow. I mean, the 6 does kind of do it where it's like, do you want to wait? And I remember one of the first times I played, I was like, why would I wait? And
this whole place is falling apart.
And then Shadow doesn't come back, and it's like, oh no, what have I done? And Realm gets Interceptor, but Shadow's gone, and it's like, oh no.
Yeah, that's one of those, like, almost a prototypical JRPG things, right? Where, I can never figure out, at least in the older games. Now, obviously, in the newer ones, like, the 7 remakes and all that, and 16 and forward, there's a very different approach. Mm-hmm. But on the older ones, I can't figure out, was something lost in translation, and therefore, the markers that would have been there, we didn't see them? Was it for replayability's sake, right? You can go back in, take a different path, and get a different, set of events and outcome. Or was it just one of those things where the developers just try to pack in emotionally impactful things wherever they could? And so, your example with Shadow is one of those where, you as a player wouldn't expect that, and it comes out of left field, and like, you've now lost Shadow, and it's an impactful thing that, it gets you right from an emotional perspective as a player, but then also now prompts you to replay so that you can go back and do it again. Yeah.
I kind of always took it as just like limitations at the time, or they just didn't know. Cause again, there's a lot of times where they're like, go to South Figaro, and you're like, I guess I'll go south, and there's 2 caves to the south. Hope I find it, So I think, I think a lot about like the difference in games. Like, I remember one of the first examples that I personally encountered that I noticed it was in BioShock. And in the very first BioShock, it's got the compass at the top that's like, your destination is in that direction, or it's got the arrow saying like, that way is your destination, but it doesn't point you to anything else. It's not like, hey, you can get some side stuff over here, or you can get some side stuff over there. And I remember just being like, oh, it didn't tell me, or it's telling me where I can go. But games, early on games were just kind of like, have fun.
Yeah, like Final Fantasy 1, like you were just cut loose and figure it out.
What are tutorials? We don't know, but I don't know if that was like hardware limitations or if that was just like them not thinking about it, because tutorials are pretty much standard now.
They're
very
standard.
few games are going to let you loose and not tell you what to do. And like, bless a good tutorial. I really like when a tutorial can come out and just be really cool. Like, I just watched a video the other day called flawless scenes in flawed games. I'm going to find out who it was by. And I thought that one was really cool because they pointed out a lot of really good scenes, but one of them was the tutorial to Near Replicant, and the way that it treats you and your abilities and all, and like how it shows you the main character doesn't like this one book, so he pushes it away. He wants to protect his sister, but at the expense, if it means not protecting his sister, he will, or if his sister's in danger, he will use this book that he's afraid of. And then you just go nuts with these abilities. Like, you start getting these abilities and you're leveling up and up and up. And it's not like, oh, level 1, 2, 3. It's you get to level 30 in the tutorial. But then you realize, oh, I'm supposed to be protecting my sister. But in the moment of feeling so cool, like, oh, I got all these awesome abilities, everything is rad, you forgot the goal. And it was just a really interesting, like, a cool way to do the tutorials. And I want to make sure I can.
I definitely think that a good tutorial can be very helpful and very necessary. I'm kind of two minds on tutorials. I think that I don't miss the days of it's dangerous to go alone. Take this. Okay, bye. Like,
I'm out.
Here you go,
Mm-hmm.
old man.
So it's Flawless Sequences in Flawed Games by Daryl Talks Games. It's a really good video. I just want to make sure that I credit them.
No, totally fair.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I can tell you my first experience with needing a tutorial is when I first played the original XCOM game back in 1990. There is no tutorial. There's 800 buttons. Good luck figuring out what this is. Oh, also, you're supposed to have, like, defend the planet, I think. Figure it out. You're on your own.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know a lot of people really don't like the yellow paint hand-holdiness that a lot of modern games have. I don't think it's a big deal, personally. It's never been, like, breaking my immersion. Like, sure, Horizon Zero Dawn, why is there yellow paint everywhere? Well, there just is. It's fine. Final
Same with
Fantasy
Uncharted.
Uncharted. A lot of modern games have the yellow paint to be like, hey, you can climb this, just so you know.
Yeah.
And, like, I do get it. Maybe it is a little immersion breaking, but, like, it can be helpful. And if you've not played the games that we all have, some kid picking up Uncharted for the first time may have no idea, like, where to go or what to do. And
it's one of the running jokes we have on our podcast, because that specifically, the yellow paint, has shown up in the 7 remakes now. And it's no secret that Square owns the same company that does Tomb Raider, where that stuff originated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we call it the Tomb Raider paint. The Tomb Raider's all over the place. We're Lara Crofting now in Final Fantasy. And because now the teams are housed now in the same company, it does make sense that they borrow, like, some talent from that side over to this side.
Mm-hmm.
But then obviously that extends out into other franchises, like you said. So it is a little bit, like you said, it doesn't break the immersion, but it's kind of funny to watch to see, like, you're playing Final Fantasy, but it's like a Tomb Raider game at this.
Yeah, even Resident Evil uses the yellow paint in 8. In Resident Evil 8, there's just yellow paint everywhere, and one of them is specifically messages left by someone, so there's a reason for the yellow paint. But I was like, I guess we're uncharting in here.
I do want to see a meta game where you are the person going through different levels placing the yellow paint. I think that would be kind of fun.
It's like what's the one game where it's like you play a guy who goes through and cleans up after the person who's, like, after Doom Guy or whatever.
I
think it's called Viscera.
Viscera Cleanup Squad, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're the one who's leaving yellow paint. Like, how will they know they can climb here?
Yeah.
If they don't?
Oh,
I don't mind the yellow paint, but
Mhm.
it has become a lot more egregious lately.
It's a lot of places.
Viscera
I
Cleanup Detail is the
That's what it
name
is.
of that game, where you're
I
the
do
guy who
remember-
cleans up after the Doom guy has gone through the room.
I do remember. I don't remember what game it was, but I remember there being a game that started using, like, blue paint or green paint or something. It almost seemed like they were like, we need to shake this up. So
Yeah.
let's.
Reinvent the
color.
formula. Green paint.
Yeah, I know in the Breath of the Wild they use, like, a different color as an indicator of of stuff like that than yellow. Yellow is, again, that's now, granted, I don't know when it originally came into, but the first time I remember seeing it was in Tomb Raider games. So
I saw it earlier in Mirror's Edge, because it was to let the player, because since it was designed entirely around parkour, it was to let the player know you could parkour off this thing, and that predates that.
The first time I saw it was in Uncharted, but I didn't start playing Uncharted until 2011, right before the third game came out. So I don't know if, like, I don't have personal experience with it before then, but
no, having a good tutorial is kind of helpful. We talked about this before in a previous podcast. Driver, notoriously, there is a large amount of people who rented and bought that game who has not gotten past the tutorial because they don't explain well how to get through that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Grand Theft Auto 5, right? Like, how many people have actually beat that game versus have just played it?
Yeah.
Right? Like 1%, 2%.
There's a story to GTA 5?
Exactly. I have never beat that
I heard
game.
that was DLC.
I just drive around. I don't know.
That's all I do. Drive around and commit crime. And,
Yeah.
I mean,
it's like Saints Row. I never played the game. I never played.
I was going to say,
I never played the story.
I think that covers most of Rockstar's games.
Yeah.
But
there's a story and other stuff.
I just want to be a cowboy running around, all right? It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
It's almost like Rockstar was like, okay, let's figure out what we want to do that's fun, and then we'll put a story around it.
Yeah.
And that's our game. And hey, it's worked. Those things sell like hotcakes.
Yeah.
To kind of go back to the secrets and, not having tutorials and sort of the way games used to be, I do think it's kind of one thing I'd like to see return to the Final Fantasy franchise is the secret character. They did it in 6, they did it in 7. There's a couple other that come to mind. I think 4's after story has some secret characters. I don't know, man. There was something so cool about like finding a character and being like, you look different than everybody else.
Yeah, it was peak 90s. Like even Mortal Kombat, right, had a secret character. It was kind of a thing that went like from the 90s forward, but you're right, it's kind of fallen out a little bit.
I'd like to see it. Like, I mean, I like having the full party, 7, 8, 16, you being like, here's your friend, here's this person, now they're your buddy, whatever. But I do think it would be cool to have like here's this one weirdo, go give them meat or whatever. Like that they live in a coffin, go figure it out.
Golgo, who lives in the mouth of another Esper.
Yeah, like just like here's this weird little guy, you can recruit him maybe if you do the right things.
Yeah, a lot of those things just they became I don't want to call them memes, but kind of their own little concept going forward. Like to this day, if I'm going somewhere far, I'm like I'm getting in a whale and going to the moon.
Yes.
And most people are like, what are you talking about, right? But it just like stuck with me, and I'm like, yeah, we're taking a whale to the moon, that's what's happening. And there's no, and what I would love to see, honestly, like, I know this is stupid, it's never going to happen, but I know there's a lot of countries that are gearing up because they all want to go settle the moon. Like someone needs to make one of those things a whale and send it to the moon.
We need to put the aesthetics back into our science fiction, or I guess our science fact. It's clean, white is a great aesthetic, I guess, but like, let's give some character. The X-Wing is not the X-Wing because of its color. Like it's
right.
It's a cool thing, but also you paint that thing black and orange, and it's like, oh, okay, it's a fancy X-Wing. All right, I get you.
I will say, Final Fantasy VI specifically hid stuff all over the place. So, and we've talked about hidden conversations because depending on who you brought in, which, by the way, even this early on in gaming history is a nightmare, because when you have a way to make it so every character can be in the party, you have to write your script so every character can be there and make sure it sounds right. So you could do that. Also, what I found out with it is and I don't know if this is traditionally for all Final Fantasies, but specifically for 6, there is the world before, the world of balance, and then the world of destruction, which is after Kefka messes everything up.
World of Ruin.
A world of ruin.
Yeah, that definitely happens in a lot of Final Fantasies. Maybe not all, but there's it's either a change in the world like we saw in 6 and 2 or 4 for that matter, or it's a change in the paradigm, right? It'll go from like pre-apocalyptic to post-apocalyptic, same world, just the paradigm has shifted. Even in 16, it happens when Ultima takes his little spaceship up into the middle of the sky, right? What happens after that, I forget the term for it in the game, but it's the same thing. I call it pre-apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic scenario in the game.
Mm-hmm. And so Final Fantasy VI, I think, is the earliest one that has something like that. I don't remember if the ones beforehand. Final Fantasy IV, the parts I remember, because that's one I didn't play all the way through, is when Cecil becomes a paladin, is where the big change happens. Goes from Dark Knight to paladin. But for 6, it's the World of Ruin. Now, the thing is that stuff changes in your world. There is treasure chests and things that are out there that you can pick up during the game, or you can wait until later and get newer items.
Leo, could you pick up that save point for me?
That save point's moved.
That's not a save point. That is a callback to one of our earlier projects, but we were playing
Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, Chrono Trigger, and I thought the save point was a chest. I was like, Leo, you got to grab that. Leo, it's on the ground. It's on the ground, man. You got to grab that.
We were so confused. Like, what are you talking about?
I was really tired that day.
But yeah, no, you can go off there, and I do love that there's hidden stuff everywhere, except for no. So for Sabin, it's you could get all of his abilities if you just know if he has enough mana to pull it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like if you do it right, you can get Pearl, which is one of the strongest magics you can get very early in the game with Sabin. But Edgar's, and this always stuck with me, Edgar's chainsaw that you can find. So if you go to this dark and creepy town of Zozo, and then in there you can find a clock. If you set it to the right time, I think it's 666, you can get Edgar's chainsaw. What does it do? It'll try to instant kill anything out there. If not, you still hit a guy with a chainsaw. It still does damage.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of them. There's all kind in dungeons. There's like hidden rooms, right, that you can get to certain treasures in there that, unless you happen to know or you're willing to explore. And that's the other thing, right? In 6 and some of the other ones, even in 7, and we can make the argument that the pixel remasters changed the genre here, but the number of random encounters per like square millimeter of screen space to get those hidden things was just such a slog. Yes. In 6. Yeah.
There have been points in that game where I'm sitting there going, I know there's something cool on the other side as well, but I just don't have the time. I gotta go. It's taking forever. Wow. Oh, and I've just jumped like 5 other levels trying to get over to the bathroom.
Exactly. And it's crazy because if you think about it, well, I mean, remember, that's another thing I always try to remember is to think back of what were things like in this era. And, 6 and then even before, the companies were not releasing games that often. There weren't that many companies releasing games. So a lot of times these games had to last you a very long time, right? Like sometimes years between releases. So number one, you would hope that it was replayable. And number two was that, you would spend a lot of time playing because you knew that you were not going to get another game for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And they really packed a lot into a game at the time. Like,
written in assembler. It's nuts. It's nuts what they were able to do back then. Like I always say, like these were the true, legitimate programmers and designers. To do it in an 8 and 16-bit world is so difficult.
Some of the pixel artwork in, like, when you look at the like the Kefka Tower of oh my gosh, the pixel art is stunning.
You mean Sauron's tower?
Yeah, that's the one. the Kefka Tower. That one was really cool. I would love to cross stitch it, but that would probably take my entire life because there's so many pixels. But it's like, and some of when you see like the Esper, like a lot of the enemy, like you're this awesome little 8-bit character, but then you get these incredible pixel art enemies in battles. So cool. It was so
Bright
cool.
Design is a lost art, like it's not even just Final Fantasy, right? The Dragon Warrior, the Pokemon. I mean, name a game that wasn't in 3D, and the pixel work therein is astounding. The level of detail they can get by, well, this is a light gray, block, and then there's a dark gray next to it, and it gives the appearance of a shadow when you're zoomed out. Like, it's incredible the way that they can do that.
Yeah, I remember watching some documentaries a while back about, people designing games during this era and watching them like design it. And then they had to watch it on a CRT, right? Because the CRT introduced its own wonkiness with the color palette and just like the refresh rates. And they would look at it and say, that's not right. And they would go like off to redo it again because it didn't come across in the CRT right. And like you said, it's kind of a lost art. And that's why, when I saw the Sea of Stars get released, I was just blown away because it was a group of people who had that level of dedication to pixel-based art, bringing back something amazing in the modern era. And I'm hoping that more like indie developers and small studios release games like that, because while I love what Square Enix is doing and I love the artwork they do in their new games, I'm one of those people that says I'd rather you put more money into the story and the gameplay than the artwork. Not that the pixel artwork is easy, but I know for a fact that modern 3D 4K rendering is incredibly expensive, right, for this type of games.
If I can shout out another game, it's called Bloomtown. It's a little indie game that you can get that's all pixel. It's an RPG social sim pixelated. The trailer has some horror elements, which I'm super into, but that's one that I always like to call out because I still need to play it, but it is. I saw it and was like, okay, the artwork is stunning. It really goes back to some good, beautiful pixel art, but also I just love a good RPG and social sim. So
yeah. I actually prefer the less detailed artwork, the pixel-based artwork than the modern stuff. Again, I appreciate what Square Enix is doing and I love what they're doing, but when someone is able to do the old style just with modern tools, it's amazing what they come up with.
Yeah. And it's like when you look at Chrono Trigger, when you get into the 16-bit or the 32-bit era, and it's so stunning to see, like, even that wouldn't be considered like overly detailed by modern standards, and they still pack such good detail in there.
I think there's definitely kind of a middle ground too that we can. I recently played Unicorn Overlord on the Switch.
I love that game.
It's been a lot of fun, honestly. I sunk a lot of hours into it, and while it is not pixelized, I wouldn't say it's done in the traditional pixel style, but it's also not this like stunning, 3-dimensional graphics. It's sort of done, I guess, kind of in an anime style, if you will. But it does seem like it kind of marries that idea of like, it's not pixel, but it's also not like blow your mind realistic 3D.
Yeah, sort of like Persona.
Yes. Where like it picks an art style and sticks to it. And I imagine still probably expensive, still probably very much so like a big part of their budget, right? And it should be because art is gorgeous and it makes the game. But it did not detract from it, as in some of these AAA titles that have mind-blowing graphics, but the gameplay sucks, so the story isn't there. As you mentioned earlier, I think that there is a way that you can kind of have the best of both worlds, where like the art is maybe a little more simple but still detailed, and then the gameplay and the storyline fills in the gaps therein.
Yeah, we talked about that because probably the most famous example of that would be going from Rondo of Blood, which was 16-bit sprite-based Castlevania, going to Symphony of Night. This was so hard against the director which you don't even hear about doing this nowadays for a AAA title or such. The director basically kept their entire team together for their art team on purpose because he wanted Symphony of Night to be made as sprites. He didn't want to change it. And they're like, you're going from, a 32X and the Sega Genesis, and now you're going over to PlayStation. It's a lot more powerful. No, we're sticking with sprites. We are not changing that for nothing.
When you have a vision,
right? And think about it. Look back at that era, right? I always look at like PS1 and 64 and look at that era and look at the transition that happened. And again, Square Enix with Final Fantasy VII, they obviously was it's a great game, no complaint. But a lot of the games just do not hold up that went to the polygon versions. But those ones it kept in the 16-bit sprite base, they still stand up to this day.
Oh yeah,
huge. I love Dino Crisis, but it's rough. Like
Yeah,
it's a
Superman
rough
64.
game.
Look at that, right? Like there were so many bad ones, but there were good ones too. But I feel like the ones that took a little bit longer, that kind of kept their 16-bit roots and waited until the polygon kind of era had cemented itself, those games still stand up to this day. Whereas a lot of the early polygon games just don't.
To just really quickly kind of jump off Leo's point there, Sven mentioned it at the Game Awards this year, and what it takes to make an award-winning video game. And part of that was you keep the team together, you pay them well, and you make sure that they're not doing too much overtime. Not to turn this into too much of a political soapbox grandstanding, but I really do think that there is some merit to that. I think that gaming as a whole and game creation as a whole has gone to this sort of like light bulb method, where a light bulb burns out, you just replace it with another light bulb. But it's like, yeah, but like you're not pulling from the same light bulb drawer. You've got an incandescent here and an LED there or whatever. This is a stupid metaphor, but I think you get my point. Like keeping the team together as they did in Castlevania and as they did in some of these, the Final Fantasy team, sure, lost some people here and there, but largely they tried to keep certain pieces of it as intact as possible. And it really kind of benefited from that quality and from that vision, that overarching vision that we see. So, I definitely think that it's something I would like to see more in the game creation space, is keeping teams together who make good work so that they can continue to make good work. And I get it, we're all trying to save money and whatever, but I do think saving money comes at the loss of creation, and that's a shame.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I actually see it across industry. Like YouTube is a great example, right? Look at how small content creation has grown and where it is now, and look at how big budget Hollywood and these other studios are just constantly failing us and falling on their face. Right. It's because in their infinite pursuit of profit, they've like completely neglected everything else that mattered. Where you look at small media and it's generating so much better quality things than big media is nowadays.
Absolutely.
I forget who says it, but somebody's like, you can get all the bells and whistles and cool drawings as you want, but if you've got a bad story, there's nothing that's going to save.
Yeah, it can look true. A game can look beautiful, but and that's something I've often said, is if you have a great story, but your graphics or gameplay are like, I'll look over it. But also if you have like really good, sometimes gameplay, not graphics, but sometimes gameplay can save something for me. Even if you have like a meh story, but you have really cool gameplay, like chances are I'll stick with it because I'm having fun with the gameplay. And one of those that I'm like, I don't want to call it meh because I do really enjoy it. And I think it has a lot of merits, but the game Scarlet Nexus.
Oh yeah.
I think that one is really fun. It's got a really cool hook, but some of the gameplay is so fun and so unique in a way that like even during the parts where I'm like, all right, can we move on? I'm still having a ton of fun though.
I agree. I wish they'd explain a little bit more in that game, because there are parts where they're like, it has kind of a Final Fantasy 13 problem where they're throwing a lot of words at me that like I don't know the meaning of.
Yeah, the Lassie and the Fassi and the
yeah.
I was like, I have no idea what's going on here.
And we love 13.
Yeah, 13 is one of my favorite Final Fantasies. Like, no hate to 13 from me, but like it definitely doesn't do a great job where they're like, yeah, they're a falsie, but that person's a Lassie, and I'm like, what's the difference?
It's like they put like Tolkien, like if you've read Tolkien, not Tolkien the movies, right?
The appendices.
Like but if you've read the books, it's the same thing. It's like, okay, where am I again, and who am I talking to, kind of thing. Again, one of the most prolific authors of the genre. I'm not like trying to pretend he's not, but his writing is thick, right? It's just you get lost very easily.
Well, even I'm not sure if he did, but even his descendants got lost. Like as a quick aside, there's 2 Legoloses that are mentioned. And we've all just kind of assumed we've all just been like, yep, it's the same guy, even though it doesn't really make sense that Legolas would have been in these 2 places.
Right,
it's the same guy. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
I think it was because I have a trouble trying to read the original Lord of the Rings because it's tough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it.
It's a little dry.
But I've read The Hobbit twice, and I think I could only name one of the 12 different dwarves that they have there.
Yeah,
but I know they all rhyme.
I'm a massive Tolkien fan. I've read everything he's published, even like the Silmarillion and is more esoteric, even the published like notes and works. It is crazy. It like to keep up with that, I could not expect anyone other than somebody who's really dedicated to that world to pay attention to it, because again, it is super thick writing, but the story, like the underlying story in there, is solid. It is rock solid, right? And so that's a hard one to say negative things about, even though it does have its, you know, its faults here and there, but the core story is solid there.
Liz, I really thought you were going to bring out the bouncer, not Scarlet Nexus, to be honest.
The bouncer doesn't have a great story.
I have a weird love-hate with the bouncer, but my copy is signed by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn. So
she's so great.
I can't believe I have that. No, the bouncer is another one that's like fun gameplay, but oh my god, is the story just so stupid. But I would die for a remake of it. I would play
HD remaster.
I would
Let's
play
go.
the crap out of it. I convinced, like 10 years ago, I actually bought a PS2 multi-tap just so I could play. So I was replaying the game with my friend, and I got a multi-tap so we could play the multiplayer together. I was like, this isn't a good game, but I have like a love for it. Anyway,
The bouncer. Now, to be fair, now bringing this back to Final Fantasy VI.
Yeah, sorry.
If we talk about a good story, that doesn't mean that you can't inject silly or odd moments into your story. Like, this is a story that they have where there's rebels going up against the Empire, very Star Wars-esque, where they have to do this. All right, we're going to need to get over to that island. Let's go to an opera. What?
Well, I think levity is important in a story where, because, and I've said this a lot about Final Fantasy X too, which so few people like, but without the levity in it, and yes, there is a lot of like ridiculous and silly moments, but that game would be pure depression. And I think 6 is the same. Like, you get Celeste being embarrassed at the opera because she, like, it's embarrassing. She might have stage fright, but she's a shockingly good singer. But her being like in the back room while she's practicing and getting embarrassed when Locke sees her in that beautiful dress for the first time, and just like having those moments are important in a story where dark things are happening. And when you're uncovering like how like Kefka poisoning Doma Castle, if you didn't have something like, I think shortly after that you see Sabin and Cyan like kind of being like, oh, charge through the enemies. Cyan just lost his wife and child, and he's just like, oh, Sir Sabin, we should, and you know, it doesn't take away from the fact that he lost his wife and child. Like, nobody's out here like, he could be acting a little bit more sad. It really is just like, you need those moments so that when Cyan does sit down and process what happened fully, it's really impactful. Like, I think if you didn't have those kind of silly moments, it would just be depression fuel.
Yeah, that's one of the things about JRPGs. I always say that JRPGs are one of those, it's one of the, and now granted, there may be other genres that do similar things, but to me, JRPGs have always been the one genre that is like so life mirroring art and art mirroring life, right? And we talk about this in our podcast about the 7 remake and Rebirth, where the developers and the storytellers use this exact methodology where you have a very depressing part of the game, and then immediately the next chapter you're at Costa del Sol, or you're riding the tourist boat and there's this ridiculous stuff happening, and then the next thing you know, a bunch of people are getting slaughtered on that boat, and it's a constant reset of the reset of just the mood of the game to keep you from like either going into a severe depression, because JRPGs are one of those where it's like, if you don't exit a JRPG having known like pain and suffering and then triumph, was it really a JRPG?
Exactly. And much to your point, I think Rebirth did that like dichotomy so well, where, because I never once felt like, I don't know, when you're on the boat and you're doing the Queen's Blood competition, I was having a good time, but I didn't feel like it was taking away from everything that has just happened. And then when things happen afterwards, I'm like, oh man, I really miss how fun things were at Costa del Sol, but not in a way where I'm like, I regret this game. I think that Rebirth actually really does a lot of that very beautifully. I think Rebirth is my favorite. So
it's a constant balancing of like the emotion level of the player, right?
Yeah.
Going through it. And that's actually quite skilled to do something like that, right? And I know like you also have to contend with people's personality types, right? Because there are people who, you know, they play JRPGs because they enjoy the challenge, they enjoy the grind, they enjoy the, you know, the like utter depression for the triumph at the end, and they don't want the levity in any of that. But then there's other people who are like, look, we're just normal human beings and we got to balance this. Like we can't have just an entire game of depression and then we win at the end and we're happy. Like it's rough.
And I agree with that one, because the best stories are ones that can balance their levity like that. Like, and to this day, two of my favorite moments in Final Fantasy VI are also two of the silliest moments that you have. And one of them is at the opera when Ultros attacks you, and the Ultros attacks you, and you fall onto the stage, and poorly improvises as best as he can to this is part of the story. The band members, if you pay attention to the text, the band members who are there in the opera house are like, go with it. All right, we'll play.
Just play.
Play on.
Yeah, the conductor's like, let's go. Let's keep going. We got this.
And they're just sitting there playing through all this giant fights happening. The other one is Sabin throwing a train. I believe there is two
suplexing the train.
There is two types of people who have played Final Fantasy VI: the ones who play it by the tactical means, and the ones who threw us train.
Yeah, for sure.
The Pixel remaster, I remember there was a big outcry because initially in the Pixel remaster, when Sabin suplexes the train, it didn't come back upside down. And people were like, how dare you? Like, of all the things that people could have chosen to complain about. And, you know, it was a little bit buggy and what have you when it first came out. People were like, you let me suplex a train properly. And Square actually had to go through and patch in the suplex so that they could do it.
I can't even imagine how difficult it was to take these games that were written in assembler and bitmaps and rehash them into a different format to be able to be played multi-platform.
Yes.
It was huge.
I have a friend who does who she actually works at Nintendo doing, like, currently she does lot check, which is literally just making sure that a game is compatible with the Nintendo Switch. And so, like, she'll get a game and she has to spend like 30 minutes to an hour with it and just make sure all the button prompts are good. And she's like last line of defense, like her and that team are last line of defense to make sure that everything went properly, because if it doesn't, you have to send it back to the developer, who has to be like, I thought we had this. And like, I've done some development myself, like some software development, and like that's hard. It can be really complicated.
It's incredibly hard, right? Like it's not, I mean, I'm sure people think like, oh, we're just going to like grab the original code, throw it on top of an emulator and release it as a game, which you could do, but they didn't do that here, right? They actually tried to like refactor the code. And again, this, for me, as far as I'm concerned, this was just an interim step for them to work on the proper remakes, like the reimaginings of them, but they're going to take years and years and years and millions of dollars to get those out the door.
Yes. And I think that, sorry, I completely lost my train of thought.
If you want a weird modern example, we talked about this in the Mega Man episode. Mega Man 9 was completely done as 8-bit sprites and having to redo all the original code just to make it look like Mega Man from the late 80s, early 90s on that. And that was, you could do more with it with the technology now, but also you have to go in and painstakingly do it by hand. You can't just like, there isn't an asset for this. We have to rebuild the asset to make the asset for this.
Oh yeah. I actually have a friend who works as a VFX artist, and one of the projects he was put on was, you know, redoing the graphics for one of these older, you know, pixel bitmap based games. And I remember him telling me he looked at like the original bitmaps and some of the other stuff, and he's like, these artists, like, they're both unbelievable, and he doesn't know how they were, like, he looked at the stuff and he's like, it shouldn't have worked. I don't know how they did it, but they pulled it off. And then when he had to redo it, in modern times, he's like, I literally had to like redraw the entire thing in a 3D, Studio Max, set it all up and then down res it, as opposed to the other way of doing it. He's like, they were masters of this art, so much so that when I looked at those drawings, it's like, this should not have worked. I don't know how they did this.
Well, and I think that's also why a lot of the time when you see like indie games coming out, they'll be generally on one system. They'll be on one platform because it's so hard to get to other, like, I've backed a couple of games on Kickstarter, and one of them came out officially came out halfway through last year, and they were going to be on PC and Switch, and then they were like, we have to cancel the Switch port. Like, there's no way the Switch can handle this. And I think that I mean, it's a farm sim, but it's like a pretty massive game, and so you gotta like trying to imagine like taking these old games that thankfully they had the source code and all this stuff to it, but porting it from early to mid 90s to 2024 2023, like that's insanity. And to imagine that, like, even just to think about the compatibility issues that could arise from it, I feel like I would lose my whole brain.
Yeah. On the one hand, it's gotten easier, but on the other hand, it's gotten more difficult, because now, like, PC, Switch, PC, Xbox, PlayStation, they're all generic x86 processors at this point, right? So like that's not hard, but the Switch is different. Mobile is different, right? So that's one of those areas where it's like we still haven't quite congealed. And honestly, I'm hoping that like Switch and Xbox just move to ARM at a certain point. Sorry, Switch, Xbox, and PlayStation move to ARM, because if you look at the current flagship phones from Apple and Google, the processors in those are more powerful than these consoles at this point, right? So like there's, as far as I'm concerned, there's no point to stay on this old x86 technology. Just move it to ARM, have it ARM across the board, and then it's easier to port between all of these. But that's up to people that are far above my pay grade for that decision.
You're talking way too much logic here too.
Well, as a developer, right? Like that's not what I do for a living, but I've done it in the past, and I do it, as a hobby now for my own personal projects. I'm always like path of least resistance. Can I write it once and automatically compile to multiple platforms? That's the thing there. Yeah.
And that's just I feel like that's one of the biggest hurdles, is making sure that, or like getting to a point where let's streamline it as best as we can without compromising quality.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially with something like this. So if you notice throughout this podcast episode, we keep talking about games that happen later in life. And the reason why we do that is because games like stories, they originate somewhere. And Final Fantasy VI, even though it came out for the Super Nintendo, is one of the bigger ones that changed the game for a lot of other games for it. Not just with Final Fantasy, with other games out there for it. Between like Chrono Trigger, where you could switch around to your entire party, for example, that's to completely different people, or even just story beats, various things. They are all inspired one way or another by Final Fantasy VI. It's one of the big, is the reason why this game still hits on a lot of people's like top 100, not even JRPGs, just RPGs or even video games of all time lists. It keeps getting on pretty high up on that list.
And how complicated, like we were saying, they're beautiful games and they hold up even to this day. And then like as I've gotten older, I've become a lot more interested in how how they're made and how they've gotten to where they are. And like the fact that the entire Final Fantasy VIII soundtrack files were lost is that's insane. But it was a different time, and they just were like, hey, maybe we don't need to hang on to this. And so Arnie Roth, the conductor for Distant Worlds, and Nobuo Uematsu had to sit down and rewrite all of the sheet music for the Final Fantasy VIII, just so they could perform it at concerts.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'll be at the Distant Worlds in March in San
Nice.
Jose here.
That's gonna be so awesome. I've been a lot.
Yeah, I've been to a few of them. I went to one, oh man, it must have been 10 or more years ago, where Nobuo Uematsu actually came and he did a like an after thing meet and greet. That was amazing. I have some signed CDs of the early I think maybe 2 or 3 CDs they released. Now there's tons of them, but
Yeah, that's so awesome. I was at one where Nobuo was there, but he walked like 6 feet away from me, but I didn't actually get to meet him.
yeah.
I got to go to one with Riki.
Mm.
She like came out of retirement to do a few concerts, and I got to meet her and Susan Calloway, and I was like, this is the highlight of my Final Fantasy existence.
Yeah, and that's another thing is, you know, composing music for the music engine on this Super Nintendo was difficult, right? Because it wasn't like you couldn't use like a full symphonic, you know, orchestra and release it in the, you know, the high quality that you can nowadays. You literally had to feed it into an engine and like down res it into I say very fewer channels than you would have available today. And what Nobuo Uematsu was able to do with music on these systems, the NES and the Super NES, is nothing short of amazing.
Oh yeah.
There's a whole like, because people were like, okay, one of the biggest things was we want to have like a 1-minute loop so that it doesn't get repetitive and annoying. Uematsu was like, I'll do you one better. I'll make it so like it's like a 3-minute loop that sounds fully orchestrated but in 8-bit. And like that's something that I always really commend Square on, is it seems like they are always pushing the barriers. Like
I looked at what Soken did with 16, and it just the dude just does not miss. Like every song just nails it in that track. And so like 6 is the same way. Every single piece of SFX and music in this, it's right, and it's matched to the scene, matched to what's going on in the story in 6 at the time. Even little things like the victory theme, the battle theme are just like, they're so iconic. And 6, granted, some of that existed before, but like 6 is really where I think most people kind of cemented onto it. So
I think 6's victory fanfare is one of my favorites. 6 and I think 8 10.
Yeah. And even the overworld adventuring music, right, in 6 was just on point. Like everything they did was just so meticulous and well planned out. And it's gotten, you know, I don't want to say it's gotten worse over time, because that's the wrong way to look at it, but it's definitely gotten looser over time. But I feel like with 16, I have high hopes. I feel like they're bringing it back together. And with the 7 remakes and stuff, like they're finally like pulling back the best parts of Final Fantasy, which I would say kind of like, again, kind of congealed in 6, and then they're bringing those forward. And that's because any video game company who's making games nowadays, especially ones where there is a long tail on that franchise, has to find a way to appeal to the people like myself who are an older generation, right, playing this, and the new and upcoming generation. So they got to figure out how to balance it together. And I think they're doing an excellent job. And I think a lot of it has to do with, they looked back at 6 and 7 and said, what worked there? What was the draw? What was the hook? And let's bring that forward into the newer game.
And the fact that you can look at 6 and 7 and they have so many iconic songs and themes and such, like I'm gonna say it, like 12 soundtrack isn't that good, and I'm gonna stand by it. It feels very boring all the time. I think there's like 1 or 2 songs where I'm like, oh, okay, I can listen to this, but it's not like 6, 7, 8 where I'm like,
even 10 is iconic, right?
Yeah,
and then after that, it kind of now 11, I played 11 for over 10, 12 years. You know, I played the heck out of that. And those songs, I literally will listen to 11 soundtracks on YouTube as background music, just because I love, like, 11 is my favorite Final Fantasy that was not a mainline, you know, it wasn't 6 is my favorite, but the music from 11 was also on point. And then I look at like 15, it was like, it was okay. 16,
like
yeah, they finally brought it back. Like it's a hook again, and I'm happy for that.
Yeah, and I really like, there's some tracks in 15 that I enjoy quite a bit. I think that there's like, some of them are really nice, but like a lot of it something that our friend Liz often brings up is it hummable? And like I can hum Terra's theme, I can hum the opera, I can hum the like the battle theme, but and like I love the 13 soundtrack. You can't hum a single tune. Even Blinded by Light sounds like a mess if you try to hum it. But I feel like 16 really brought it back around and is like, you know, there's just like beautiful songs that aren't as complicated. And there are some really good complicated ones, but like they don't have to be beautiful. And I think that like 4 and 6, I haven't played like the first ones. I've only played part of 1, 3, part of 3, 4, and then 6. But 4 and 6 have just like incredible music, and it's like there's a lot of really good like backing instruments and a lot of really good like complexity, but like you can just pick the main like themes and just hum it to yourself.
And it was amazing that 6 was able to do it again on an NES, right? Because, or Super NES, because, you know, once we got to the Polygon era and the PlayStation 1, you got to CD-ROMs where you could have, you know, these elaborate cutscenes and, you know, much more elaborate music. The entire genre shifted at that point, right? Because now they were taking advantage of this new technology they had. But with 6, it was still like, okay, we are limited by the technology of our time. Like we cannot cross into the real world yet. And really 7 wasn't quite there yet. But like, if you look at, again, the 7 remakes and then 16, they're now fully in the modern world in terms of instrumentation and symphonic orchestras and what they can do. And just to look back at 6 and be like, how did they do this so masterfully on a 16-bit system? It's just mind blowing.
It's incredible just to, and yeah, Uematsu like worked miracles with his soundboards. It's like I definitely think that the music from 6 is one of my favorites. Sorry, they tend to be a lot of the earlier ones, especially. I think 12's was really boring. I didn't really care for 15s too much. I love 16s. 13s is like, it's good, but like it's still not like fantastic. But you go back to the earlier ones where they just had, I don't know, they just were like, hey, let's make good music. And I dig that.
And you got to give it up to Uematsu, because like you tell him what genre you need in this game. That is about it. Literally, it's never their music team. Most of them have never even seen an opera, and they were just told, "We need an opera scene," and they're like, "I got you. We'll do this."
Yeah, he's like, I always compare him to John Williams. He's like the John Williams of the JRPG world. Because could you imagine when Steven Spielberg came to John Williams and was like, "Look, I got this idea. I'm going to make a movie about dinosaurs. And I need some epic music for this movie about dinosaurs." And John Williams was like, "I got you, man." And to this day, the Jurassic Park theme is one of like the most iconic pieces of music ever written for a movie about dinosaurs. Like the kind of music that John Williams can do for cinema is exactly what Uematsu does for, you know, the JRPG world.
I think it helps. Like Uematsu obviously had to have been classically or professionally trained to be able to do that. Yeah. He understands like what does it take to make an opera or a rock song or something to that effect. And you see a lot of that. Like it's similar to like Akira Yamaoka, who does the Silent Hill music and is like beautiful and rock and iconic, and like I love his music. But then you listen to his music from Rumble Roses and it's like dance techno, and you're like, this is the same dude. But I think that's what makes it so brilliant, is like they are versatile, and that makes them like valuable, I guess. And also what makes them so unique in what they do.
And I believe there's one track for every single character in this game, for all the
this was I believe this was one of the maybe, if not the first, one of the very early ones where the characters all got character motifs or their own themes. I guess, you know, most people call them their themes, because that's one of the things that that Square Enix has done now in the more modern, like 7 remakes and 16, is not only do they have character themes or character motifs, they have light motifs that go along with them too. So they will mix, you know, a character theme in with a background theme at the same time. And so, of course,
the things they've done with Sephiroth's theme in the remake and Rebirth is so incredible.
Oh yeah,
We've talked about this before in our music-based episodes, especially until you get into the PlayStation era and the Polygon era and higher. You have only so much space, and you still have a game to make, and so a lot of those games will have. There's a reason why some of these games had, what was it, in the beginning with the NES, you're lucky if you had 5 tracks for a game.
Right.
Mega Man 2, not the first one, pushed that with 25 tracks. And for the SNES, you had more space, but you still had space to deal with. And so, there's like almost 30 songs that's in here that I can remember. And there's probably still way more above that in their sound effects department.
Oh, yeah.
And like we were saying, a lot of them had to be like loopable within like 1 minute, just so, because they were like, we need to save space, but we also want it to be memorable and or not repeat to the point that you hate the song. And that's like a really tough balance to strike.
Yeah, and then Nintendo has had like this obsession with cartridges, right? As opposed to discs. And so like where everybody else went to disc because they were like, look, we got more space, we can do all this stuff. Nintendo was like, yeah, we're just going to keep sticking to cartridges. And hey, I'm not going to judge them on that, but that put constraints on developers, designers and musicians all along. And to this day on the modern day Switch, it still carries some of that, right? So I've always said, like, as an engineer, that's what I, grew up as. Efficiency is our ultimate goal. It is the most beautiful thing in this universe and the most difficult thing to achieve, right? Simplicity and efficiency are incredibly hard. So to watch just what these developers and designers and musicians did on these 16-bit and 8-bit systems is just, as an engineer, it's just like so impressive. Like, no matter what I've done in my life and my career, I look at what they did and I think to myself, am I technically capable of doing what they did? Sure. But that was amazing for their time. And it's just like you owe like a debt of gratitude, because anything we do today, we're literally standing on the shoulders of those giants for what they did in their era.
Everyone else walked so we could run is basically it.
Straight into a wall nowadays. That's the problem. Like,
Yeah.
the game, that's a whole nother, like, we talk about it in our other we talk about it in our other podcast a lot, where it's like, I look at what the indies have done to the game industry positively, right? Like they've caused the AAAs to just like get kneecapped, and they're not recovering from this. And I'm looking at media and I'm like, I hope that happens to them too, because I'm tired of what Hollywood's been spitting out like the last decade. It's just, rehashed, regurgitated stuff. And I'm hoping that like independent media starts putting out a lot of really good stuff. Because I think at the end of the day, like we're moving from a system where, like, if you go all the way back to the earliest, of what the United States did, and then the rest of the world, with us, but it was, AM radio, one direction broadcast, a couple of channels, it was very consolidated and very, one-to-many relationship. And now with the internet and with small media, you're seeing a many-to-many relationship start to organically emerge as kind of the new paradigm going forward. So I'm hoping that in the games industry, we see the same thing happen. In media, we see the same thing happen. And then the hope would be you have a lot of young people who are like, you know what? I really love Final Fantasy VI. I want to make a game like that, but I want to tell a different story with it. And then they go and make it, and people are like, this is amazing, right? Like, that's what I want to see. I don't want to see like, these massive, Bethesda just cranking out the same garbage on this outdated engine that's been outdated since before Skyrim. They're still using it, right? Like, come on, move forward. let's get with the program.
We don't need the 100th iteration of Skyrim again.
Yeah.
I think that's about all I've got with this. We've kind of touched every theme that they had. The biggest theme that Final Fantasy VI had overall is that you can have more than one main character. You can have more than one thing going on at there. There's so much more. Like, if we wanted to break down Final Fantasy VI and go through each level thing on that, this would be an hours upon hours long podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Probably a day.
We could do it.
We could do 8 hours plus on just this game. Yeah.
Yes.
And just this game alone. But this is the start. There's but that's sort of what they went into designing this game originally as, which is we need to put as much as we can for this one game. How do we do that? So that way everyone can have their moment to shine, their moment in the story, little fun things that are just something that they do, and how they do that.
Well, sorry.
No, go for it.
So, I'm in a Facebook group called Cozy Gamers, and I think it's amazing. Everybody has a different view of what cozy is. But something that somebody asked was, is there microtransactions? And that kind of hit, because I was like, that was never a thing before. We were never looking at Final Fantasy VII like, are there microtransactions? Am I gonna have to pay extra to get cosmetics or weapons or what have you? And
or hopefully not the story.
Yeah, or the story. Final Fantasy 13 locking the true ending of 13-2 behind a DLC.
15 with all the DLCs that didn't
I have a lot of beef with 15. But like, that's something that I also miss, is just like, and like, when 16 came out, they didn't intend to make a DLC. They were like, we just want to give you a full game right from the off. We want you to have a game that's complete start to finish. And then it did so well, and people were like, we want DLC. And they were like, okay, we'll give you some DLC. But it was because the fans were like, we love this game so much that we would pay for this. And so then they were like, okay, let's do this. It wasn't something where they were like, we're going to release it, and then you can get all this extra stuff, and then you can do X, Y, and Z. I felt like that was something that was really nice, especially coming off of 15, where it was the anime, the movie, the novel, the pocket edition, the regular game. Apparently there was a whole prequel thing, like small scene or screenplay that you can actually go find. Like, there's just so much of it. And then there was that free like pixel side scroller game where you play as King Regis, which was actually like surprisingly fun. It's just wild. Like, and then 16 was like, Yoshi P came in and said, we just want to give you a full game.
Yeah, and that was the right thing.
We're gonna do.
And that was the right thing, because I mean, I could spend all day talking about business models and why the AAA industry is doing this to themselves, and there's a very simple solution to it, but that's a different podcast episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, microtransactions in general, like that, they would be the villain in 6. If they were to try to attach those here. But one of the things I did want to talk about, because I know, Leo, you had put a note in it in your
in my notes,
notes, was about the Kefka character.
Yes.
Yeah. So Kefka is my favorite character from the game. As I mentioned, 6 is my favorite of all the Final Fantasy franchise. Kefka is my favorite character, and I actually have a massive framed artwork of Kefka on I have one on each side of my wall here. On one side is Kefka, which to me is like the most prolific villain of all of video game history, and on my other wall is Nicol Bolas, the most prolific villain in all of the Magic multiverse, right? The Elder Dragon. And these two have a very similar bent, but we on our Final Fantasy podcast, I like to talk a lot about how these things pull from pop culture and how they influence pop culture. And the Nietzschean nihilistic aspect of Kefka is one that's always amazed me. Specifically, we talked about how he was tortured, and how he was not who he was before, and then eventually, through mental illness and a couple other things, ended up in this, as this amazing villain in Final Fantasy VI. And one of the things I always like to say is, I think most people at this point have watched The Dark Knight and have seen Heath Ledger's interpretation of the Joker in that movie, which was amazing. To date, as far as I'm concerned, the best Joker that has ever crossed the screen. And
Jared Leto could never.
And Joaquin Phoenix did a great job for like the origin story of it. I'll give him all the credit for that. But to me, Kefka is what Heath Ledger's Joker aspires to, right? Like the level of just absolute nihilism and just and what I would even call passive nihilism, to the point where it's like there's no active role here. He just doesn't care. There is no morality, right? He's just like, I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do. And on the one hand, you get these sequences where you feel like this guy's just nuts, right? What's going on here? And then in the other ones, you see his plotting and his careful manipulation of other people. And you're like, wow, this guy is like simultaneously unhinged and a genius at the same time. And it results, as far as, again, I'm concerned, one of the most complicated, complex, yet amazing villains that I've ever seen in a video game.
Yeah. If there was a comic book equivalent for him, it would be the Joker. Completely psychotic, but also at the same time a genius at what he does.
That was like not really like the point, but that was what a lot of it came down to, was like he is like the Joker. And I don't think that that's like a bad thing. I think that's actually incredible.
It makes him interesting where it's the only thing he really goes for is gaining more power. But that's just because he was told originally, hey, your job here is to help us find all as much of this just like, because the plotline is magic's gone, but whoever can get their hands on enough magic could control a lot of stuff. And while the Empire is using Kefka as their lead attack dog, Kefka, on the other hand, is also still playing the Empire. Remember, Kefka gets in pain and injected with this magicite. At no point does he stop. Yeah. He's like, no, just come on, give it on. And it is until the Emperor, right before the World of Ruin, where the Emperor is like, oh no, we got to stop, because it's not just espers that are coming out. It's a bunch of other monsters that are locked away because of those statues. And once Kefka's like, no, let's roll it. Let's just get it. This is how we have to open the door to get everything. I'm in. I'm sold.
And so much so that, like, even after he moved the statues, right, and he basically created the World of Ruin, and then after that created Sauron's Tower, and was sitting there doing the Light of Judgment, like Sauron's eye all over the place. It at least in the game, it reminded me of kind of like he was the dog that caught the mailman, right? Like, he moves these statues, he becomes uber powerful, he builds Sauron's Tower, he's sitting on top of it, and now he's bored. And so he's just torturing people because that's his form of entertainment as a psychotic individual. But there's nothing else for him to do. Like, he's just sitting there, and like there's no, from his perspective, there is no plot progression beyond that, because he's now achieved the pinnacle of whatever it is he thought he was going to achieve. And now he's just going to sit there and torture people because he's bored. It's the rest of the characters that then, have the second, or I guess the final act of that game to close it out. And then because Kefka realizes that they are coming to undo what he has done, now he has a purpose again, right? On the final act of the game. And his purpose is to stop them so that he can, continue his reign of terror. It's almost like they figured out how to depict a tyrant in perfection, because at a certain point the tyrant becomes all powerful, but then what do they do?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I was thinking of when like that note was added about Kefka and nihilism was when he becomes a god and he suddenly knows everything. He's like, it's futile. And it's often said, when you reach that point of nihilism, because there's a lot of different types of nihilism, but the one that happens here, some people are like, I'm going to do good despite the fact that there's nothing else, there's nothing after this, there's no meaning to it, I'm still going to do good. But then there's the people that are like, what does it matter then if there's no good, or if there's nothing and this means nothing, who cares? And Kefka leans so extremely towards the who cares, that he's just like, I'm bored, I don't know what to do. And he keeps taunting, as you're climbing the tower, he's taunting the heroes like, nothing you do is going to matter in the end, so why do you do it? And it's not like, it's not so much that he's trying to deter them because he doesn't want them to continue. He's literally like, there's no point. There's literally no point.
Yeah, it's almost like he wants to enlighten them that there is no point to all this. He even says something to the effect of like, why do humans, or why do people always want to build things that are going to be destroyed anyway? And just like complete, like the utter pointlessness of existence. like he reaches that level. It reminds me a lot of Ultima in 16, right? Where,
Mm-hmm.
you know, he is a god and he's like, there's nothing left. Like he has no other place to go other than to try to fulfill this prophecy so that he can become even more powerful to ostensibly, like, I don't know, regenerate his species that, you know, had lost its way or whatever. But it's the same thing. He reached a place where there's just no point to any of it anymore. And Kefka's amazing in that his arc from like a normal person who was a loyal subject of Gestalt to being tortured, becoming powerful, overthrowing his captor and his torturer, to then ascend to a god and then just become bored because there's nothing else to do anymore.
Yeah.
What an arc, right? For a villain. It's insane.
Yeah, and I love him taunting the characters on their way up, because it's like like we were saying, it could be like, there's no point, but it could also be like, why? Like, genuinely curious, what do you hope to gain from this?
Yeah, and it parallels, like, you know, to Leo's point, like, how does this go forward? And like, this is exactly what happens at the end of 16, right? Spoiler alert. When Ultima is there, Ultima has the exact same, like, why do humans do this? Why do you just not give up? Right? Why are you so strong-willed? And you know, it comes back to this. Actually, it's the same exact concept in 6, which is the group, the party, the team is doing it for each other. And as a unit, they are far more powerful than one god. The exact same story in 16 between Ultima, Clive, and then the other people in the story, which is it's like, it's almost a reimagining, except that Ultima is not psychotic. He's at the point where Kefka ascended to a god and was just bored at that point, and it was pure nihilism. That's where Ultima is. And to be honest, they have the same exact reaction when they're finally at the point of being defeated. They're both shocked that they could ever be defeated, given their like god complex. And it's, again, that you can draw a line straight from 6 to 16. Those two games are just like, they're almost linked. And it's amazing to, again, developers, storytellers, everybody pulling from 6 and 7 and just drawing it forward into the modern era is just, it's amazing to watch.
Yeah. The one thing about that I didn't find out until I got through the research through this, and I forgot about. So Terra is your first character that you get in the game. Terra is also one of the last characters that have dialogue in the game, because one of the big things is, if they win against Kefka, there's a good chance Espers are gone for good, including Terra. And part of the afterworld of it is eventually coming to the realization, yeah, this is doing the good. It will if we succeed, will outweigh the fact that I'll be here by the end of this.
Which, by the way, is the same exact thing that happens in 16 when they defeat Ultima and Magic leaves the realm. Clive dies.
The way I was heartbroken
as a result of that.
Leo's never played it.
Oh, sorry.
No,
yeah,
that's okay.
Fine. I knew
we
that
are
coming in.
Spoiler heavy podcast, so
yeah. But again, like direct correlation between these two games.
The ending of 16, I was a mess. It was but like in the best way. It was
almost as bad. It was bad, and I say bad. Bad in a good way. It was almost as bad as 10 was at the end, right? Where it's just like you're sitting there and you're like in shell shock, right? Just watching this screen, I couldn't believe what was happening in front of my face. But again, after I finish every JRPG and I walk away like in that kind of, I don't even know what you want to call it, stupor of having just, I have to remind myself, like, you cannot exit a JRPG without having known pain and suffering and everything in between. And, you know, this is a little bit hyperbolic, but I think this is the right podcast to say it. You are not, you personally, you as the player, you and I, everyone else, you are not the same human being when you finish playing a JRPG as you were when you started playing that JRPG.
It's so true. And I feel that way. This is not, I mean, Final Fantasy VI, of course, but Nier Automata did that to me. I was changed as a person after Nier Automata.
Absolutely.
if you have a good story and a good game, you're basically like that Bob's Burgers means that, like, I don't want to sell you on this, but it'll change your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the, I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but it is life changing.
Yeah. You will not be the same when you finish it. And that's so important though. Like to go in knowing that you're going to be a different person when you come out of it. Like, I almost don't want it if that's not the case. Like I don't mind I don't mind a simple game, but if I don't feel some kind of emotion about it, it doesn't have to be that I walk away from your game bawling my eyes out. But if I don't feel some semblance of like heartbreak or something, it's like, like I've been playing Harvestella, and like it's a fun little JRPG / farming sim sort of thing, and I'm having a good time with it. But like something sad happened, and I was like, I didn't really know her that well. I didn't know that character too well. So I understand that the character is in pain, but I'm like, okay, like that's sad. And so to me, like the storytelling in that game, even though I'm having fun with it, I'm not moved.
I think one of the reasons that these games are so powerful, and in my opinion have become more powerful in today's day and age, is because the selflessness, the self-sacrifice, the positive traits of our heroes, and even in the villains to an extent, are so lacking from the modern world, in modern humanity. We hardly ever see it. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's definitely not a common. And it's almost like you feel bad because you know that if human beings had more of these character traits that our heroes do, we would be in a much better place, as a species and as a civilization, but we don't. So, I feel like, the games give us kind of a preview of what it could be like, but it's real life is just not that. And it never has been. Right. So, but again, I do commend 6 because there were just so many themes and so many, story arcs, character development, villain development, character progressions. There's so many things that, again, if not originated in 6, definitely congealed in 6. And we can see the DNA all the way through to 16. And it's just what a work of art. That's kind of how I feel about 6. And I personally cannot wait to see 6 remake.
Yes.
To me,
I'm
is
ready
like,
for it. I'm so ready for it.
Yeah.
Leo,
as long as I get it before I die. Yeah. As long as I get it before I die, 20 more years, whatever. I just give it to me before I die and I'll be a happy camper.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I would also personally like an 8 remake with like a lot of modifications to some of the stories to make it better. But again, I'm kind of in the minority that just really enjoyed 8. It's flawed, but it's fun.
It doesn't know what it's doing.
Doesn't know what it did.
Anyway, but I think that is about it. To close this out, saying 6 is a good game is an understatement. There is so much it changed for storytelling, JRPGs, RPGs in general, and just how people look into video games. And like we said before, you can find the line that starts with 6 going all the way up until now. And there's more that's coming down the pipe for that. And if we could get a remake, that would be amazing, and preferably soon-ish. I'm willing to wait a few more years, let it work its kinks out.
At minimum, we have 3 people right here who would buy it day one. I'm telling that to Square. Just like if they remade the Bouncer,
we still have the 3rd installment of 7 coming out, right? And then 16, I know they released a DLC or 2, and I think they put the lid on that one. I don't know what's coming after that, but these games typically take 3+ years in development before they hit a retail shelf, and that's if it's one contained game, and 6 is one of those that is, again, given the constraints of the era, right? We know that it fit on a cartridge and it went on the Super NES. But if they remade it, it would absolutely be a trilogy, and it would take multiple years to produce. So I get end to end, you're probably looking at a 10-year span for that remake.
Just saying.
I'll
printing
wait.
Money.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I I would love to now. Not only would I love to see the reimagining of Kefka, right, which they've already done in other corollary content around Final Fantasy, but I want them to get the voice actor who played Roche in 7 Rebirth and Remake. That's who they need to play Kefka in the remake.
You're so right. I didn't even think of anything like that. I didn't have any voice actors in mind, but no, you're correct.
You need the flamboyant, over the top, like just showman, and the way he did the Roche character was just flawless, impeccable.
Yes.
Kefka with that voice actor would be untouched in villainry in all of video games if they could.
So
get
fun
it.
Too. The charisma that he would be able to bring to it would be delightful.
Oh yes. So if Square's watching this, you need that voice actor. Yeah,
please.
I think to close this out, if you could pick a character on here to pick a voice actor for the remake that should eventually happen. Now, I'll let you pick any voice actor ever on there, but one character they'll have. Who would you pick for that? So I have an idea with Sabin on a weird way. I could see John Cena playing Sabin.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
I never would have considered that. I'm gonna pronounce this wrong. And I don't know if I'm 100% sold on it. Xanth Huyn. She played Haru in Persona 5, Marianne in Fire Emblem 3 Houses. She's got a very she is very versatile, but the voice that she's kind of known for is a little bit more like I'm not gonna say higher pitched, but I don't mean like, oh my god, like it's just a very feminine voice. I think I could see her for Terra.
That's a good one.
Yeah,
too,
I can see that. Yeah,
I think I'd have to really. I think that would get a lot of controversy. I think that people would not be satisfied with it, though.
It's crazy because female voice actors are so much more difficult, just because the crossover in the culture and like the expectation of the anime kind of mousy dialogue versus what Western culture is used to. You're always going to have somebody that's not happy about it. It just doesn't matter. It isn't the voice actor could be phenomenal and flawless at what she does, but again, the translation between the cultures and how it's never going to land for 100% of the audience.
Yeah, it doesn't matter that Brianna White is brilliant as Aerith. People really didn't like her at first.
Exactly, and I thought she did great. Like but I get it. I get it. It's just so much harder. But again, it's the cultural crossing, right? I don't think yes. There have absolutely been miscastings. I'm not going to try to sweep that under the rug, but I think most of the time they're very good. They just, different cultures, different ways of looking at voice actors.
Yeah.
And it's rough like that, but I agree with you. I think she would be an excellent fit for Terra. And I already gave mine, which is I'm going to pick Kefka every time because he's my favorite character in the game. And I don't know the guy's name, but the one who played Roche in 7 Rebirth and Remake, that guy is just, and it's funny because I hadn't even considered it up until I played the Remake and Rebirth and played, fought his character twice and said, this is the guy. This is Kefka right here. Guaranteed 100%.
It is a dude named Austin Lee Matthews.
There you go.
I've heard that name before. I don't.
Oh my gosh, he was in Persona 3 Reload. I just always like to see what people are in. I was hearing Leo play Marvel Rivals the other night and was like, that's a character in Genshin. That voices.
Yeah, that guy just, I don't know what it is, but every now and then it's kind of like Val Kilmer and Doc Holliday, right? Like every now and then you get a voice and just a character, and the two just meld together and they're inseparable at that point. The way he did Roche is like, man, I don't know how he did so good with such a over the top and flamboyant character. Like that's hard because it's so easy to come across as inauthentic with a character like that.
Oh,
but he didn't. Like he just nailed it. So yeah, if he could be Kefka, I would be incredibly happy.
Yeah, he would sound incredible. That would be rad. Yeah, I'm gonna stick with Xanth Huyn. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. for Tara. I don't care what people say. I think she'd be adorable as Tara.
I think that'd be great. So with that, to our audience, just in the comments or even message us on our socials, let us know what voice actors you would pick for any of the other Final Fantasy VI characters. And it could be whatever gambit that you want. Find a spot for J.K. Simmons. He's in a lot of stuff, and I like him.
Yeah. Which character would you assign Keanu Reeves to?
Ooh, that's harsh to say. I would say
answer that in the comments.
Yeah, answer that one.
Yeah,
and also,
I would say Shadow person. No.
If you could get Dwayne The Rock Johnson to voice one of the characters, put that in the comments. Who would that be?
Ifrit. I want him to be a summon.
Ooh, yeah.
I think Keanu could definitely be. We're on a first name basis, apparently.
Yeah.
I think he could play a really good Shadow personally. I think that if you just give him like if you have him be in a bit of a deeper register, he would be a really good Shadow.
Yeah, because that's the closest you could probably get to like a John Wick, right? Is a Shadow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In this game. Yeah, in this game.
I love John Wick. Anyway.
All right. With that being said, our next episode will be available, because this will be out in February. So our next episode will be available on February 21st. That being said, thank you everybody for listening to this episode. And thank you again, Ernest, for coming on to this show.
It was a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
We are so glad to have you.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back anytime.
Yeah. With that being said, this is Gaming Theater Podcast logging out. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Gaming Theater Podcast is hosted, created, produced, and edited by Leo Garcia, the Geek Scorpio. Our music is A Drinking Game. Stock media provided by Stormwave Audio /Pond5. Our cover art is by Adam Parker. You can find him at ParkerGFX on Twitter. If you want to send us some money to help with these episodes, you can do so at patreon.com/gamingtheaterpresents. Want to send support that doesn't hit your wallet? Please leave a review with wherever you hear your podcasts and share our podcast with your friends. It really helps out. Thank you for listening.